Excellent. Hey, thanks for joining us. This is just going to be a quick video. We were talking in an MR and some code review about questions about what was going on in our package manifest as we were uploading slippers to NPM. And Javi had some good questions about it and thought that we should record a conversation answering those questions. So we're going to step through very specifically, and yes, we'll link that in the description for sure. It's in the agenda here. We're going to step through and we're going to take a really focused lens to keep this short and digestible. We're going to start actually with Laura had some errors in her console that were very related to exactly the stuff we want to get into. So we're going to start there as an entry point. Which is a useful word because that's part of some of this. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with these errors, how we would troubleshoot them, a little bit of the bigger picture stuff. And if there's more to go off of, as I'm sure there will be, we'll do some other short videos too. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the agenda. My stand-up comedy tour. Love it. Okay, so here's my screen. Excellent. And so everything changes now that my Zoom window is different. So looking at the agenda, Lauren posted this screen, not Laura, sorry, apologies, posted this screenshot of these errors saying that when you were working locally, there were these warnings that the modules can't be found and it wasn't a problem in production. Do you want to say more about what was going on there? Any other details about what you were what were you trying to do? I wanted to try and duplicate this and I wasn't sure what specific workflow you were in.
Yeah, so this was actually, I probably should have realized this, but I was doing work on an older branch. I'd only copied the Git repo for slippers, I don't know, a week ago or so. So I hadn't had any of that set up on my machine. And I'd been working on a branch, and then I went back to that branch with slippers set up and saw all these errors and was like, that's weird. Like, I have slippers and it says I don't have slippers. So that's kind of where that came from, but yeah.
Sure, absolutely, that makes sense. So there's a quick solution or a quick thing for people to note if they're doing local development on about.gitlab.com. We have this documented in our Webpack docs. There's a link in the agenda here. There's a known issue with Webpack dev server where the dev server stays attached to the process too long. And so sometimes, so if you're seeing console errors, they may look like this, maybe a little bit different, but you'll see WDS stands for Webpack Dev Server. If it can't find files, it may just be that you have an old process running that has not found new files. That does happen. Usually you'll see 404s for that. So I didn't think it was necessarily that, but it could have been because it presents differently. So there's a document in the repo about how to resolve that. You just have to kill the process and restart it. So, and that's kind of out of scope for we don't control that. That's just a known bug with dev server. But here's what the actual solution was, right, Laura? This was the fix here. So, and I'll talk about how I got there. So I'm looking at this error. I see a lot of module build failed. I see the word module a whole bunch. And then here's what really got me thinking that this is what it was. If you look at in each of these messages, there's a file path at the top. So this is module identifier and then users, Laura Duggan, www, all the way down to this. There's a source file, but then there's also a node underscore modules path identifier there. So and this gets to the broader point of what all is going on with modules, ES modules, CommonJS, all these imports, Webpack. I would almost never expect, not never, generally you wouldn't expect to see node underscore modules in a 404 or error message in a browser console, because that is a folder that, typically speaking, bundlers like Webpack, they know about it and they provide something else to the browser. So in these two, you see these two errors. The first one is I'm okay, Webpack is having a problem with something because node underscore modules is there. And the second one is where it says source JavaScript slippers, that kind of makes me think that this is actually also a Webpack one. Here's another note before I get to the conclusion. Webpack dev server will inject its own scripts into your local site instance, and it will give you its own error messages. So you also have to parse out, is this coming from code being executed in the browser runtime, or is Webpack dev server telling me something? And that's why they have these like notes like WDS. So that's a thing to like be careful of. So looking at that and thinking like, oh, this might be a Webpack issue, I was like, this, to me, my first instinct is, and even if I didn't have all that detail and someone was like, if someone just said to me like, hey, I'm running this locally and it's not working, I'd be like, cool, like delete node modules and type yarn. Like that's probably, that would fake, it's just the classic, like turn it off and on again, but for Webpack or for JavaScript or like places where Node meets browser-based JavaScript. This is the place to do it. So yeah, and that ended up working, and like it really was. Basically, what's happening here is Node modules, the folder isn't version controlled along with all of the like Webpack config and all of the files that basically there are a bunch of files that expect, like they tell Webpack, hey, go find this other stuff in node modules, and they expect it to be there. But since your node modules folder is not version controlled along with those changes, if you have not like kept up to date, if you switch branches like you said, and your node modules is out of date between them or it's out of sync, you will have problems. We had a community contribution, or maybe this was from a product team person who added a nice warning message now. So if you try and like run a yarn command in about.gitlab.com or in the repo, you'll get it in if your node modules don't match your package lock file or your yarn lock file, you should get an error. I don't know if it's entirely foolproof, but that should help a little bit with some of this and catch it earlier on. So that's how I came to that conclusion. And fortunately, that was the solution, which is cool. And then if we can talk about like what's happening, we got a couple like 2 or 3 minutes left if we want to walk through the chain of what's going on. Do either of you two have like thoughts on that, questions on that, on the troubleshooting side, specific questions about what's going on?
No, nothing specific. I think you're right that like having doing a quick walkthrough of how the data flow happens. You went over that before the call, and it was super helpful.
Cool, awesome. So I'll try and keep it brief. It's hard for me, but we should be good. So I wanted to start by taking a look at Webpack config. We're gonna make some assumptions about pre-existing knowledge here about like kind of what Webpack is and why you might use it. But we can go further deeper in other conversations. So we also have this documentation in the like hard-coded doc file, which is generally meant for developers. But if you're curious about this stuff, we have the really detailed like what's going on with Webpack under doc/webpackmd. It's linked in the agenda, which I will link here. And so there's two things that Webpack does for us right now. We either run it in production, it just like runs as a command and consumes our configuration file, which you're seeing here, and like takes input files and turns them into specific output files that middleman like relies on. Basically, we say, Webpack, give us these specific patterns of files using this specific input. And then we say, middleman, I want you to assume that you will have this generated output, right? That's what Webpack provides to us in the CI configuration. Excuse me. The other thing it does is it acts as a dev server. And at the bottom of the Webpack config file, there is dev server configuration. And so this runs differently and separately from the Webpack process itself. This is what we use in local development. It gives us like, it allows us to see our changes faster, basically, without having to rebuild the whole thing. But it does present a handful of other challenges. Like we said, like there's a bug with dev server where it doesn't kill the process appropriately. The other thing is that it does all of the stuff Webpack usually does on the disk. So like Webpack manipulates files, right, on like a hard drive or a solid state drive or something. That's what the Webpack production mode does. In dev server, it does it in memory. So instead of like writing files to disk, it does it in the RAM, which also means that it's harder to inspect the actual state of the generated output. You can configure dev server to do it, but it's like slower and like finicky. So here's a tip for troubleshooting. If you want to see what Webpack is going to do, you can just run Webpack in production mode from your local command line. And that's in the package JSON. There's a script for it. And I'll link to that because we're getting close to time. But then you'll actually see the output. And so you can kind of test like what's getting output. Dev server also has a URL, which is documented in this doc here of like where you can go see what dev server thinks is being compiled out. But it's a little tricky to get to. It's not always where you think it's going to be. So refer back to this doc for that. Config basically defines the behavior of how we're manipulating these files. We do it a little differently than than a traditional Webpack config is for backwards compatibility with how our project has been set up. Most Webpack config will bundle everything together in one file or maybe a couple different bundles. We do not. We basically do like a copy procedure where we do the Webpack stuff to the source JavaScript, which is in here. This is like one basically source JavaScripts are slippers.js. Webpack takes this and it'll turn it into like basically a copied version of it, but it'll transpile some stuff out for us. So yeah, we're about at time. The final thing I want to say is like, so I just want to show like, here's what I mean when I say that thing about Webpack. Here's our slippers JavaScript. We have a CSS file as well. These lines 1 and 2, and line 1 in the CSS, our Webpack configuration file, this file tells Webpack how to interpret lines 1 and 2 in the JavaScript file and how to interpret line 1 in the CSS file. It also tells Webpack where to find these files. That's what the config file is doing. And then Webpack looks at these and says, hey, I know what to do with this because you have configured me in my config file. And then it creates a thing and it like either puts it on the dev server or puts it in the dist folder. And more details to come if we do other videos. I think we're a little over 10 minutes. So thanks for watching. If you stuck around with us, thanks again to the two of you for like listening to me ramble for the whole pre-call and this, and for having the idea to put this together. So cool.
Thank you for clearing up so much stuff. Yeah.
See you next time. We'll do more.